August 24, 410 AD. The Eternal City. For 3 days, Alaric and his Visigoth warriors moved through the streets of Rome like a dark tide. They looted palaces. They stripped gold from temples. They carried away treasures that had been accumulating for centuries, spoils from Carthage, from Egypt, from Gaul, from every corner of an empire that had once seemed invincible. Roman citizens watched in shock and horror. Some hid in their homes. Others fled to churches, praying that Christian sanctity would protect them. Many simply stood paralyzed, unable to comprehend what was happening. Rome, the city that had conquered the known world, was being sacked by barbarians. It had been 800 years since Rome last fell to an enemy. 8 centuries of dominance, expansion, and glory. The very idea that Rome could fall had become unthinkable. Romans believed their city was eternal, protected by the gods, destined to rule forever. Now that illusion lay shattered in the streets alongside broken statues and looted treasures. The fall didn't happen overnight. It wasn't one battle, one betrayal, one catastrophic moment. The collapse of Rome was a slow-motion tragedy that unfolded over centuries. A combination of internal decay and external pressure, of political incompetence and economic crisis, of military exhaustion and cultural transformation. But on that August day in 410 AD, as Alaric's warriors ransacked the city, one thing became undeniably clear: Rome was no longer invincible. The empire that had built roads across continents, ruled millions from Britannia to Mesopotamia, created legal systems that still influence modern law, that empire was dying. The question isn't just how Rome fell. The question is how it lasted as long as it did. How does an empire maintain control over such vast territories for 5 centuries? How does it survive constant warfare, political assassinations, economic crises, and barbarian invasions? And once that survival becomes impossible, how does the greatest empire in human history simply end? This is the story of Rome's decline and fall. Not the empire at its peak, when legions marched invincible and marble cities shone white in the Mediterranean sun. Not the myths and legends that make Rome seem eternal. But the reality: 500 years of glory crumbling under the weight of its own ambition. It's a story of warning signs ignored. Of leaders who prioritized personal power over public good. Of an economy built on conquest that collapsed when conquest stopped. Of soldiers fighting everywhere and protecting nowhere. Of citizens who stopped believing in the empire they once served. It's a story of how even the greatest civilizations are mortal. How glory and hubris are often inseparable. How what seems eternal can become dust. The sun set on Rome. Not quickly, but inevitably. And in that sunset, we can see the shadow of every empire that has ever risen and fallen since. To understand Rome's fall, you must first understand its rise. Because the very factors that made Rome great contained the seeds of its destruction. Rome began as a small city-state on the Tiber River in central Italy, founded according to legend in 753 BC. For centuries, it was unremarkable, one city among many, ruled by kings, then by a republic of senators and consuls. But Rome had advantages. Its location provided access to the Mediterranean while being defensible from the interior. Its citizens developed a military culture that emphasized discipline, organization, and ruthless effectiveness. And most importantly, Rome developed a political system that, for all its flaws, was remarkably stable and adaptable. The Roman Republic expanded gradually. First, it conquered the Italian peninsula, defeating rivals like the Etruscans and Samnites. Then it fought the Punic Wars against Carthage, gaining control of Sicily, Spain, and North Africa. By 146 BC, Rome dominated the Mediterranean. The transition from republic to empire occurred during the 1st century BC, as military commanders like Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, competed for supreme power. Civil wars ravaged Rome, but from the chaos emerged Augustus, Rome's first emperor, who established a system that would last for centuries. Under Augustus and his successors, Rome reached its territorial peak. The empire stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine and Danube rivers to the Sahara Desert. It encompassed an estimated 70 million people speaking hundreds of languages but all living under Roman law. The achievements were staggering. Roman engineers built roads that connected the empire, over 250,000 miles of highways, many still visible today. Aqueducts carried fresh water to cities, sometimes across valleys using multi-tiered arches that seem impossible for ancient technology. Public buildings, forums, bathhouses, amphitheaters, demonstrated Rome's wealth and sophistication. Roman law created a legal framework that protected property rights, regulated commerce, and provided courts for settling disputes. The concept of innocent until proven guilty originated in Roman law. So did contracts, corporations, and much of the legal terminology still used today. The Roman military was the most professional fighting force the ancient world had known. Legions were highly trained, well-equipped, and organized with almost modern efficiency. They built fortifications, conducted complex maneuvers, and could sustain campaigns across vast distances. Roman military engineering, siege weapons, fortified camps, strategic road networks, gave them advantages against any opponent. But beneath this glory lay fundamental problems that would eventually destroy the empire. First, Rome's economy was built on conquest. The empire sustained itself through plunder, tribute, and slavery. Each new territory provided resources, taxes, and slaves to support Roman lifestyle. But by the 2nd century AD, Rome had largely stopped expanding. The easy conquests were complete. The borders had reached natural barriers, oceans, deserts, forests too dense to penetrate economically. Without new conquests, the economic model began failing. The empire still had enormous expenses, maintaining legions, building infrastructure, supporting a massive bureaucracy, but revenues plateaued or declined. This created pressure that would intensify into crisis. Second, Rome's political system was inherently unstable. The emperor had absolute power, but no clear succession mechanism. When an emperor died, civil war often erupted as generals and senators competed for the throne. The 3rd century AD saw the crisis of the 3rd century, 50 years of chaos with over 20 emperors, most dying violent deaths. This political instability had cascading effects. Generals diverted military resources to fight each other rather than defend borders. Economic policies became short-sighted as emperors sought quick revenue to pay for civil wars. Citizens lost faith in institutions that seemed corrupt and ineffective. Third, Rome's military faced an impossible task, defending borders stretching thousands of miles against increasingly sophisticated enemies. The legions that had conquered the Mediterranean were designed for offensive warfare, marching into enemy territory, fighting decisive battles, returning home with victory and plunder. But border defense was different. It required constant vigilance across vast frontiers. It meant small garrisons stretched thin, always vulnerable to concentrated attacks. It meant soldiers spending decades in remote fortresses rather than conquering new territories. The psychological and strategic shift from offense to defense was profound and demoralizing. Fourth, Rome's social structure created deep divisions. A small elite controlled vast wealth while most citizens lived in poverty. Slaves, captured through conquest, performed much of the labor. Free citizens in Rome itself often survived on grain doles, free food distributions that kept them from rioting but also from productive work. This created a society where the elite had little connection to common people's struggles, where huge populations were dependent on government support, and where the work ethic that had built Rome atrophied into entitlement and complaint. Finally, Rome faced a cultural and spiritual crisis. The old Roman virtues, discipline, duty, simplicity, sacrifice for the state, eroded as wealth and luxury became paramount. Christianity, spreading through the empire, offered different values: humility, charity, otherworldly focus. This wasn't necessarily negative, but it represented a fundamental shift in what Romans believed and how they saw their place in the world. By the 3rd century AD, all these problems were intensifying simultaneously. The empire was overextended, politically unstable, economically strained, socially divided, and culturally transforming. It was like a building with structural cracks in every wall. Not yet collapsed, but under immense stress, with new pressures constantly being added. The question wasn't whether Rome would fall. The question was when, and how catastrophically. But in 200 AD, as citizens walked through marble forums and watched gladiatorial games in the Colosseum, most couldn't imagine Rome ending. It had existed for nearly a millennium. It controlled the known world. It was, in their minds, eternal. They were wrong. The sunset was approaching. And in the next 2 centuries, everything they took for granted would crumble into dust. The 3rd century AD was catastrophe in slow motion. Historians call it the crisis of the 3rd century, but that sanitized phrase doesn't capture the chaos. Between 235 and 284 AD, just 49 years, Rome had at least 26 different emperors. Most died violent deaths, assassinated by their own guards, killed in civil wars, murdered by rivals. The instability began in 235 AD when Emperor Alexander Severus was assassinated by his own troops, who were dissatisfied with his policy of paying Germanic tribes to avoid war rather than fighting them. The soldiers proclaimed Maximinus Thrax emperor, but he was murdered 3 years later by troops who preferred 2 senators who declared themselves co-emperors. This pattern repeated endlessly. Emperors rose to power through military support, ruled for months or years, then were killed when the army found someone who promised higher pay. The throne became a prize to be seized, not a responsibility to be honored. The political chaos had devastating consequences. Generals diverted resources to fight each other rather than defend borders. Provincial governors declared independence, fragmenting the empire. The Gallic Empire controlled Gaul, Britain, and Hispania from 260 to 274 AD. The Palmyrene Empire controlled Syria, Palestine, and Egypt during the same period. Rome had effectively broken into 3 separate empires. Meanwhile, external enemies pressed from every direction. Germanic tribes, Goths, Alemanni, Franks, raided across the Rhine and Danube. The Sassanid Persian Empire attacked from the east, capturing the Roman Emperor Valerian in 260 AD, an humiliation unprecedented in Roman history. The economic crisis was equally severe. Emperors needed money to pay armies and fight civil wars. With conquest no longer providing plunder, they turned to currency debasement. Roman silver coins, once nearly pure silver, were gradually reduced to bronze coins with silver plating. By 270 AD, the silver denarius contained less than 5% silver. This caused catastrophic inflation. Prices increased 50-fold during the 3rd century. Citizens who'd saved money found their wealth worthless. Merchants stopped accepting Roman coins, reverting to barter. The monetary economy that had facilitated trade across the empire collapsed into localized subsistence. Tax collection became impossible. Who would pay taxes in worthless currency? Who would collect taxes when emperors changed every few months? Imperial revenues plummeted while expenses skyrocketed. The empire was effectively bankrupt. Agricultural production declined as warfare disrupted farming. Armies marched through fields, requisitioning or destroying crops. Farmers abandoned land they couldn't profitably work. Plague spread through overcrowded cities lacking basic sanitation as infrastructure crumbled. Population declined by perhaps 25 to 30%. The psychological impact was profound. Romans had believed their empire was eternal, blessed by the gods, destined to rule forever. Now that belief shattered. The empire seemed to be ending, not through dramatic conquest but through slow disintegration. Some sought spiritual answers. Christianity, still technically illegal but spreading rapidly, offered meaning in a world that seemed meaningless. Traditional Roman religion, focused on state ceremony and public ritual, couldn't address personal suffering or explain systemic collapse. Christianity could. It spoke of a better world beyond this one, of salvation despite earthly suffering, of hope when everything seemed hopeless. This spiritual transformation had political implications. Christian citizens felt loyalty to their faith community, not necessarily to the emperor. They refused to perform sacrifices to the emperor's genius, a ritual that traditionally demonstrated loyalty. Some Christians welcomed Roman decline, seeing it as divine judgment on a pagan empire. But Rome didn't collapse in the 3rd century. Instead, it survived through a combination of luck, determination, and radical reform. Aurelian, 270 to 275 AD, reunited the empire by defeating the Palmyrene and Gallic empires. He built new walls around Rome itself, the first time in 8 centuries the city needed fortifications, a stark admission of vulnerability. Diocletian, 284 to 305 AD, implemented sweeping reforms. He divided the empire into eastern and western halves, each with an emperor, Augustus, and junior emperor, Caesar. This tetrarchy was supposed to provide more effective administration and smoother succession. Diocletian also reorganized the military, separating mobile field armies from border garrisons. He increased army size from perhaps 300,000 to 600,000 soldiers. He reformed the currency, established price controls to combat inflation, and restructured the tax system. These reforms stabilized the empire temporarily, but at enormous cost. The bureaucracy expanded massively. Tax rates increased to oppressive levels. The military consumed perhaps 25% of GDP. Citizens who'd once been proud Romans now saw the government primarily as a burden extracting resources while providing diminishing security. Constantine, 306 to 337 AD, continued and modified Diocletian's reforms. Most significantly, Constantine legalized Christianity and eventually converted himself. Christianity transformed from persecuted sect to state-favored religion within a generation. Constantine also moved the imperial capital from Rome to Byzantium, which he renamed Constantinople. This acknowledged geopolitical reality: the empire's wealth and population were concentrated in the east, while the west faced increasing threats. But symbolically, it meant Rome was no longer the center of its own empire. By 350 AD, the empire had survived crisis and implemented reforms. But the underlying problems remained. The economy was still fragile, dependent on coercive taxation rather than productive growth. The military was larger but stretched thinner as threats multiplied. Political succession remained contested despite constitutional frameworks. Most critically, Rome faced a new kind of enemy, not raiders seeking plunder, but entire peoples seeking new homes. The great migrations of the 4th and 5th centuries weren't simply invasions. They were desperate refugee movements driven by climatic change, pressure from nomadic peoples, and attraction to Roman wealth and civilization. The Goths, Vandals, Franks, and others weren't trying to destroy Rome. They wanted to live within the empire, enjoy its security and prosperity. But Rome lacked mechanisms for integrating such large groups. The empire's identity was built on Roman citizenship, law, and culture. Could millions of barbarians become Romans? Should they? These questions would define the empire's final century. And the answers, or lack of answers, would determine how Rome fell. The signs of weakness were clear by 350 AD. The empire was politically fragile, economically strained, militarily overextended, and culturally transforming. It had survived crisis through desperate measures that created new problems. The glory of earlier centuries seemed distant, almost mythical. Citizens walking through Rome saw crumbling buildings, reduced population, diminished trade. The Colosseum still stood, but gladiatorial games were infrequent and poorly attended. The forums were less crowded. Aqueducts carried less water. The marble facade was literally crumbling, revealing the underlying weakness. Yet Rome endured. It had survived crisis before. Maybe it would survive again. Citizens couldn't imagine a world without Rome. The empire had existed for over a millennium. Surely it would continue? But outside the borders, gathering like storm clouds on the horizon, came peoples fleeing their own catastrophes. The Huns, mysterious nomadic warriors from the Asian steppes, were displacing Germanic tribes, who in turn pushed westward toward Roman frontiers. The collision between these migrating peoples and the weakened empire would produce the final act of Rome's tragedy. Not a sudden catastrophe, but a decades-long process of disintegration, punctuated by shocking moments that made decline unmistakable. Rome's sunset had truly begun. The darkness was gathering. And nothing could stop it now. The word barbarian comes from the Greek barbaros, someone who spoke unintelligibly, making barbar sounds rather than civilized speech. Romans adopted the term to describe everyone outside their civilization. But barbarian is misleading. It suggests primitive savages destroying civilization from sheer destructiveness. The reality was far more complex. The peoples Romans called barbarians, Goths, Vandals, Franks, Alemanni, Saxons, Huns, were sophisticated societies with their own cultures, laws, and military traditions. They weren't destroying Rome out of hatred for civilization. They were responding to their own crises, seeking safety and prosperity in the empire's territories. The great migrations of the 4th and 5th centuries were driven by climatic and political changes far beyond Roman borders. Cooling temperatures in northern Europe made traditional territories less viable. Population growth created pressure for new lands. And most critically, the Huns, nomadic warriors from the steppes of Central Asia, began pressing westward, displacing everyone in their path. The Goths, a Germanic people who'd lived northeast of the Danube for generations, faced this pressure directly. In 376 AD, tens of thousands of Goths appeared at the Roman frontier requesting permission to settle within the empire. They were refugees, not invaders, families with children and belongings, desperate to escape the Huns. Roman officials faced a dilemma. Allow them in, and the empire gains potential soldiers and farmers. Refuse, and they might force their way across. Emperor Valens decided to admit them, settling them in Thrace, modern Bulgaria, under Roman supervision. But Roman officials immediately betrayed them. Instead of providing promised supplies, they extorted the Goths, forcing them to sell their children into slavery for food. The Goths, desperate and enraged, rebelled. The result was the Battle of Adrianople, 378 AD, one of Rome's worst defeats. Emperor Valens led an army against the Gothic rebels. The Romans were confident, Gothic warriors on foot couldn't defeat Roman legions. But Gothic cavalry arrived unexpectedly, encircling the Roman army. In the brutal hand-to-hand combat that followed, perhaps two-thirds of the Roman army was killed, including Emperor Valens himself. Adrianople shattered Roman confidence. An emperor had been killed in battle against barbarians. An entire army had been destroyed. The Goths were now in Roman territory with no clear way to remove them. The new Eastern Emperor, Theodosius I, eventually negotiated a settlement allowing Goths to settle in the empire as federates, allied warriors who'd fight for Rome while maintaining their own leadership and culture. This seemed pragmatic, but it established a dangerous precedent: barbarian groups could maintain semi-independence within Roman territory. Throughout the late 4th century, more barbarian peoples crossed into the empire. Some came as federates by agreement. Others forced their way across. Rome's borders, once rigid barriers, became permeable membranes. The Huns themselves appeared at Roman frontiers in the 430s under Attila, the most fearsome barbarian leader Rome would face. Attila unified the Hunnic Confederation and demanded tribute from Rome. When Constantinople paid but Ravenna, the western capital, refused, Attila invaded Gaul in 451 AD. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains, 451 AD, saw something remarkable: Romans and barbarians fighting together against other barbarians. The Roman general Aetius commanded an army including Visigoths, Alans, and Franks alongside Roman troops. They defeated Attila, but barely. The victory demonstrated that Rome could no longer defeat threats alone. Attila died in 453 AD, and the Hunnic Confederation collapsed without his leadership. But the damage was done. The Great Migrations had fundamentally changed the empire's demographics and power structure. Now comes the moment that shocked the Roman world: the sack of Rome in 410 AD. Alaric and his Visigoths had been federates of Rome, fighting for the empire. But they'd been betrayed repeatedly, promised supplies that never arrived, promised land that was denied. By 408 AD, Alaric's patience was exhausted. He marched on Rome itself, laying siege to the ancient capital. Rome had not been taken by an enemy since 387 BC, over 800 years. The city's walls, built by Emperor Aurelian in the 270s, were formidable. But walls require defenders, and Rome's garrison was minimal. Most legions were deployed on distant frontiers or fighting civil wars. The siege lasted months. Food ran out. Citizens starved. The Senate frantically negotiated, offering tribute to Alaric if he'd leave. He accepted once, then twice, but the imperial court in Ravenna refused to ratify the agreements. Alaric, humiliated and angry, decided to take what had been promised. On August 24, 410 AD, accounts disagree whether Romans or Goths, opened the Salarian Gate. Alaric's warriors poured into Rome. For 3 days, they sacked the city. The sack was relatively restrained by ancient standards. Alaric was Christian and forbade violence against churches. His warriors looted palaces and wealthy homes but avoided systematic destruction. Most citizens survived. But psychologically, the impact was catastrophic. Rome had fallen. The Eternal City, capital of the world, had been sacked by barbarians. When news reached Constantinople, St. Jerome wrote, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." 45 years later, in 455 AD, Rome was sacked again. This time by Vandals under Genseric, who'd crossed from Spain into North Africa and established a kingdom based in Carthage. The Vandal sack was more thorough than the Visigoth one. For 2 weeks, Genseric's warriors systematically looted the city, stripping even roof tiles and decorative elements. Vandalism entered language as a term for wanton destruction. These sacks revealed Rome's fundamental weakness. The city that had once ruled the Mediterranean couldn't defend even itself. The legions that had conquered Gaul and Britain couldn't protect their own capital. But why couldn't Rome stop these invasions? The answer lies in a vicious cycle. Military pressure required more spending, which required higher taxes, which damaged the economy, which reduced revenues, which weakened the military, which invited more pressure. The Western Empire was trapped. It needed a strong military to defend borders, but couldn't afford one. It needed economic growth to fund defense, but constant warfare destroyed productivity. It needed political stability to coordinate response, but emperors changed frequently through violence. By 450 AD, the Western Empire controlled little territory outside Italy and parts of Gaul. Britain had been abandoned around 410 AD. Spain was controlled by Visigoths. North Africa by Vandals. Gaul was contested by Franks, Burgundians, and others. The empire wasn't a unified state anymore, it was fragmented territories nominally under Roman control but effectively ruled by barbarian kingdoms. The Eastern Empire, based in Constantinople, faced similar pressures but had advantages the West lacked. It was wealthier, with major cities and productive agriculture. Its shorter borders were easier to defend. Its emperors were generally more competent and longer lived. The East would survive as the Byzantine Empire for another 1,000 years. But the West was failing. Everyone could see it. Roman citizens, watching barbarian warriors settle nearby, wondered how this had happened. How had the conquerors become the conquered? How had Rome, which had once seemed eternal, become so weak? The answers lay in the accumulated problems of centuries: overextension, political instability, economic crisis, military exhaustion. The barbarian invasions were the final pressure on a structure already collapsing from internal decay. But one question remained: if Rome was dying, what would replace it? How does the end actually come for an empire? As the Western Roman Empire crumbled, the eastern half not only survived but flourished. This divergence wasn't accidental, it reflected fundamental differences in resources, geography, and governance. Understanding why the East survived while the West fell reveals crucial truths about what actually killed Rome. The division of the empire began practically with Diocletian in 284 AD and became permanent after Theodosius I's death in 395 AD, when his 2 sons inherited separate halves. Honorius received the West, ruling from Ravenna. Arcadius took the East, ruling from Constantinople. Constantinople itself was the most significant advantage the East possessed. Founded by Constantine in 330 AD on the site of ancient Byzantium, the city occupied perhaps the most strategic location in the Mediterranean world. It controlled the Bosporus Strait, the narrow waterway connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Any trade between these regions passed through Constantinople, generating enormous customs revenues. The city's position was also militarily superb. Surrounded by water on three sides, with massive walls on the landward side, Constantinople was nearly impregnable. It could be supplied by sea even during siege. Multiple times over the next 1,000 years, Constantinople would be besieged but would survive through its fortifications and position. The Eastern Empire's wealth dwarfed the West's. Egypt, the ancient world's breadbasket, belonged to the East. So did Syria, prosperous from trade routes connecting the Mediterranean to Persia and beyond. Asia Minor, modern Turkey, had numerous productive cities and agricultural regions. The West had Italy, Gaul, and Spain, significant territories, but less urbanized and less wealthy than the East. More critically, the West lost its most productive provinces early. When Vandals conquered North Africa in the 430s, they seized the region that had supplied grain to Rome for centuries. This loss was economically and psychologically devastating. The East's shorter borders were easier and cheaper to defend. The Danube River formed a natural barrier. The eastern frontier with Persia was contested but stable. Both empires were roughly equal in strength, creating deterrence through mutual caution. The East faced barbarian pressure, certainly, but not the overwhelming flood of peoples that inundated the West. Eastern emperors were, on average, more competent and longer-lived than Western emperors. Theodosius II, 408 to 450 AD, ruled for over 40 years, providing stability and continuity. He commissioned the Theodosian Walls, massive fortifications that made Constantinople virtually impregnable. He codified Roman law in the Theodosian Code, preserving legal traditions. The East also managed barbarian threats more skillfully. Rather than fighting every group, Eastern emperors often redirected barbarians toward the West, sometimes even paying them to go elsewhere. This wasn't cowardice, it was pragmatic statecraft that preserved Eastern resources while weakening Western rivals. The religious and cultural life of the empire shifted eastward. Christianity's most important centers, Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, were in the East. The great theological debates that defined early Christianity occurred at Eastern councils like Nicaea and Chalcedon. The East developed a sophisticated theological and philosophical tradition that would influence Western thought for centuries. Greek, not Latin, became the dominant language in the East. By the 6th century, even imperial documents were being written in Greek. This linguistic shift reflected deeper cultural realities. The Eastern Empire was becoming less Roman in the classical sense and more distinctly Byzantine, blending Roman political traditions with Greek culture and Christian faith. The economy operated differently in East and West. The West's economy, built on slavery and conquest, collapsed when both stopped. The East maintained a more diversified economy. Cities remained commercial centers. Trade continued along established routes. Manufacturing of luxury goods, silk, glass, fine metalwork, provided exports. The gold solidus, the Eastern currency, remained stable when Western currency collapsed into worthless bronze. The East developed a more sophisticated bureaucracy than the West. Ministries specialized in different functions: finance, military affairs, foreign relations, postal service. Promotion was sometimes based on merit rather than solely on aristocratic birth. Literacy rates were higher. The machinery of government simply worked better. But the East wasn't without problems. The Nika riots of 532 AD, during Justinian's reign, nearly toppled the government. Religious controversies over the nature of Christ created deep divisions. The Sassanid Persian Empire remained a constant military and economic drain. And the East couldn't ignore the West's collapse entirely. Barbarian groups that conquered Western provinces sometimes threatened the East as well. Yet the Eastern Empire endured. When the Western Empire officially ended in 476 AD, the East continued as if nothing had happened. Eastern emperors still called themselves Roman Emperor and considered themselves legitimate successors to Augustus. The empire, in their view, hadn't fallen, it had simply lost some provinces, which could theoretically be reconquered. Justinian I, 527 to 565 AD, attempted exactly this. His generals Belisarius and Narses reconquered North Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Ostrogoths, and parts of Spain from the Visigoths. For a brief moment, it seemed like the Roman Empire might be reunited. But the reconquest was unsustainable. It required enormous military expenditure. The Italian wars devastated the peninsula, killing perhaps half the population through warfare, famine, and plague. The territories reconquered were too damaged to generate the revenues needed to defend them. More critically, Justinian's focus on the west left the east vulnerable to new threats. The Sassanid Persians invaded repeatedly. The plague of Justinian, 541 to 549 AD, likely bubonic plague, killed perhaps one-third of the empire's population, devastating the economy and military manpower. After Justinian's death, most reconquered territories were lost again. Italy fell to the Lombards. Spain returned to Visigothic control. Only North Africa remained under Eastern control, and even that would be lost to Arab conquest in the 7th century. The Eastern Empire, increasingly known as the Byzantine Empire to historians, though its citizens always called it the Roman Empire, would face its own existential crises. The rise of Islam in the 7th century would strip away its richest provinces, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, North Africa. The empire would be reduced to Anatolia, the Balkans, and fragments elsewhere. But it survived. Through military reform, diplomatic skill, cultural adaptation, and sheer determination, the Byzantine Empire endured for 1,000 years after the West fell. Constantinople would finally fall to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 AD, nearly a millennium after the last Western emperor was deposed. This survival raises questions about what actually killed the Western Empire. If the problems were universal, barbarian pressure, economic strain, political instability, why did the East survive? The answer suggests that Rome's fall wasn't inevitable. It was the result of specific circumstances, decisions, and failures that could potentially have been avoided. The West lacked the East's natural advantages, certainly. But it also made poorer decisions. Western emperors were weaker and shorter-lived. Western military resources were misused in civil wars. Western economy collapsed more completely. Western society fractured more deeply along class and ethnic lines. Perhaps most critically, the West lost the will to be Roman. By the 5th century, Western elites identified more with their local regions than with the empire. They cooperated with barbarian rulers who let them keep their estates rather than supporting distant emperors who demanded taxes. The idea of Rome became less important than personal survival and prosperity. The East maintained Roman identity for centuries longer. Byzantine citizens knew they were Romans, heirs to an empire that had ruled the world. That identity motivated defense, justified sacrifice, and created cohesion. When that identity finally faded, replaced by Greek and Orthodox Christian identity, the Byzantine Empire's days were numbered. But that process took 1,000 years. The Eastern shift preserved Roman civilization even as the West fell. Law codes, architectural techniques, literary works, philosophical texts, all were maintained in Constantinople and its libraries. When Western Europe emerged from the Dark Ages, it was Byzantine copies of ancient texts, brought west by scholars, that sparked the Renaissance. Rome fell in the West. But it survived in the East. And through that survival, the Roman legacy influenced every subsequent civilization in Europe and the Mediterranean. The Eternal City died, but its ghost lived on in Byzantium for 1,000 years after sunset fell on Rome. September 4, 476 AD. Ravenna, northern Italy. Flavius Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain commanding barbarian soldiers in Roman service, entered the imperial palace. He confronted the teenage emperor Romulus Augustulus, mockingly called Little Augustus because he was a child and puppet of his father, the general Orestes. Odoacer demanded that Orestes abdicate and Romulus resign. When Orestes refused, Odoacer's forces killed him. Odoacer then addressed young Romulus, offering him a choice: resign willingly and retire to a comfortable pension, or face the same fate as his father. Romulus, perhaps 16 years old, chose survival. He formally abdicated, becoming the last Roman emperor in the West. Odoacer sent the imperial regalia, the crown, purple robes, and scepter, to Constantinople, acknowledging the Eastern Emperor Zeno as sole legitimate Roman emperor. Then Odoacer declared himself king of Italy. Not emperor. Not even Augustus. Just king, a barbarian title, foreign to Roman ears. The transformation was complete. The Western Roman Empire, which had existed in some form for over 500 years, had ended. Except, it didn't quite feel like an ending. Life in Italy continued much as before. The same elites owned the same estates. The same laws governed property and contracts. Latin remained the language of administration and church. Churches conducted the same services. Trade, though diminished, continued. Odoacer governed as a Roman ruler in all but title. He maintained Roman administrative systems. He preserved the Senate, though it had little power. He styled his court on Roman models. For most people in Italy, the change of regime meant little practically. This is why historians debate whether 476 AD truly represents Rome's fall. From one perspective, it's the obvious endpoint: the last emperor was deposed, imperial rule ended, barbarian kings controlled former Roman territories. The empire had objectively ceased to exist. From another perspective, Roman civilization continued. The Catholic Church maintained institutional continuity from Roman times. Odoacer's reign was, in many ways, a mirror held up to Rome's long decline, the reflection of an empire that no longer recognized itself. He wore Roman robes, governed from Roman palaces, issued edicts in the name of Roman law. Yet beneath the surface, everything had changed. Power no longer flowed from the Senate or from imperial decree, but from the swords of barbarian warlords who once stood at the empire's gates. Still, the idea of Rome, the invisible empire of law, order, and divine destiny, refused to die. Even as imperial standards were lowered from the battlements, the dream of Rome remained stronger than the marble that once built it. In Constantinople, Emperor Zeno accepted Odoacer's gesture of submission. Officially, the Roman Empire was now reunited under a single emperor, Zeno himself. In practice, the East had neither the strength nor the will to reclaim the West. The so-called reunification was a fiction, a convenient myth that allowed Zeno to save face, and Odoacer to rule unchallenged. For the Senate in Rome, the illusion was comforting. They sent letters to Zeno as if nothing had changed, affixed the same seals, met in the same halls. But their decrees carried no weight. The empire was now an echo, a magnificent shadow that lingered on paper long after its substance had vanished. Odoacer ruled Italy for 17 years. He respected Roman traditions, yet his loyalties lay with his own army, a mixture of Syrians, Heruli, and Rugians. When he distributed land to his men, Roman landowners grumbled quietly but complied. They were used to strongmen now, emperors, generals, usurpers. One more barbarian king changed little. Beyond Italy, other barbarian kingdoms were carving up the corpse of empire. In Gaul, the Franks under Clovis were rising, destined to found a dynasty that would one day crown Charlemagne. In Spain, the Visigoths ruled from Toledo. In North Africa, the Vandals had established a naval power that once terrified the Mediterranean. And in Britain, abandoned by Rome decades earlier, Anglo-Saxon settlers were founding their own petty kingdoms amid the ruins of Roman villas. Each of these new realms borrowed the tools of Rome, its laws, language, religion, and administrative habits, but none possessed its unifying spirit. The Mediterranean world that Rome had once bound together with roads and legions had splintered into a patchwork of successor states. Trade routes faded. Cities shrank. Literacy withered. A darkness began to settle, not the sudden plunge of night, but a slow twilight stretching across generations. Meanwhile, in the east, Constantinople endured. Its emperors still called themselves Basilius Tun Romaean, Emperor of the Romans. Its armies still marched beneath the double-headed eagle, and its scholars still copied the texts of Cicero and Virgil. To them, Rome had not fallen, it had simply changed its address. In their eyes, the Western Empire's collapse was not an ending, but a shedding, a dead branch pruned from the living tree of Roman civilization. Yet even as they proclaimed eternal continuity, the truth was stark, the ancient unity of the Mediterranean world was gone. The divide between Latin West and Greek East had become permanent. To the people who lived through it, 476 AD was not the apocalypse modern textbooks imagine. There were no grand ceremonies, no weeping crowds watching the imperial standard lowered for the last time. It was quieter, almost mundane. An old order quietly replaced by a new one, the torch passed without ceremony. But looking back, historians recognize its symbolic power. For centuries, Rome had been the idea that the world could be ruled, that law and order could stretch across continents, that chaos could be tamed. When Romulus Augustulus laid down his crown, that dream dimmed. Humanity had proven that empires could fall as easily as they rose. Ironically, even the man who ended Rome did not endure. In 489 AD, a new challenger came, Theodoric the Ostrogoth, sent by Emperor Zeno himself to remove Odoacer. After years of brutal warfare, Theodoric invited Odoacer to a banquet in Ravenna under the guise of peace talks. As they dined, Theodoric rose and drove his sword into Odoacer's heart, splitting him from collarbone to hip. The Roman palace that had once housed emperors became a chamber of murder. Theodoric then ruled Italy in Odoacer's place, again preserving Roman customs, administration, and laws. For the next few decades, Italy prospered under a Gothic king who considered himself heir to Roman civilization. It was another echo, another shadow of empire pretending the light had not gone out. Even after 476 AD, Rome's influence refused to die. The Catholic Church became its spiritual successor, using Latin, Roman law, and Roman hierarchy to govern across kingdoms. When medieval monarchs crowned themselves, they called their states empires, Holy Roman, Byzantine, Ottoman, all claiming the same legacy. Rome became an idea so vast that no single collapse could erase it. And perhaps that is the truest measure of its greatness. It ceased to exist politically, but it never stopped existing in the imagination. Modern historians now see 476 not as a sudden cataclysm, but as a slow transformation. The Western Empire had been decaying for centuries, rotted by civil wars, economic decline, and overexpansion. Its fall was not a thunderclap, but the final sigh of a giant collapsing under its own weight. Yet, even in death, Rome sowed the seeds of Europe's rebirth. The kingdoms that replaced it would one day rediscover Roman law, Roman architecture, Roman ideals. From those ruins, the Renaissance would rise, a second awakening of the Roman spirit. Walk the streets of Rome today, and the ghosts of empire are everywhere. Broken columns stand beside modern traffic. Latin phrases still echo in legal documents, cathedrals, and universities. Even our calendars, our alphabets, our governments, carry Rome's fingerprints. Perhaps the empire never truly ended. Perhaps it merely changed form, from marble to memory, from empire to idea.